My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. Nickelodeon has clearly been keen to stick with developers when it comes to making Rugrats games. Search for Reptar and Studio Tour were both developed by Nspace, Scavenger Hunt was developed by Real Time Associates who previously worked on Real Monsters, and now it's Software Creation's turn to make a second appearance. Having previously worked on the 2D handheld adaptation of the Rugrats movie, they're back with Rugrats Time Travelers. Released exclusively for the Game Boy Color, it was actually still playable on the OG Game Boy 2, although I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but I'll get into that a bit later. Software Creation still have a couple of Nickelodeon games up their sleeves too. Like I mentioned in my Rugrats movie review, they'll be responsible for a few versions of Nicktoons Racing and the handheld version of Rugrats in Paris. Time Travelers didn't do too well with critics, managing just a 5.6 average review score. The Rugrats movie had pretty much the exact same average review score, so this doesn't bode well. But hey, perhaps Software Creations have made some important tweaks to the formula that makes the game a little more fun? Just like Studio Tour was to search for Reptar, Time Travelers is a spiritual sequel to the Rugrats movie game. Obviously it's not continuing the story of that game or movie, but literally everything about Time Travelers is a follow-up to that title. The setup here is pretty bare bones. Apparently the babies have just stumbled across a time machine. Naturally, Dill has gone missing as a result, requiring the babies to go after him. Technically there's a story here, but it doesn't matter. It purely exists as a vehicle to allow Software Creations the liberty to send Rugrats characters to varied locations for every level of the game. Things manage to stay pretty fresh right throughout the game purely because of this design choice. Popping up in each new location is nice, and for the most part we're seeing environments that are radically different from those featured in the Rugrats movie. The one exception to this is the Atlantis level. It bears such a resemblance to Chucky's underwater level from the previous game that you'd almost swear that they completely reused a level. There's obviously some heavy asset recycling going on here, which is an understandable practice, but they don't make this level feel different enough. I felt like I was just going through something I'd already played. So we've got new locations, but that's about it for what's new in Time Travelers. The gameplay and objectives for levels are identical. Your goal in every level is to collect a certain amount of items scattered throughout, before grabbing one mandatory item and then finding the exit. Sequels are always going to share a number of similarities with the games that came before it, but this is just too much. They haven't even tried to shake it up. Frustratingly, they're still just as vague when explaining the objectives to players. In just about every level you start, the short mission objective text almost never gives you the full picture. Almost always it just says, find this specific item and then get to the exit, neglecting to mention that you have to collect a bunch more items on the way. You might think this is obvious from the counter at the bottom of the screen, but we're talking about a handheld game made specifically for children. Being explicit and over the top with your explanations is a necessity. The game still has issues with getting the player stuck and unable to progress in a level 2. When you take damage, you lose one of the items you've collected. I'm not sure whether this was the case in the Rugrats movie, but here the items you lose are sent back to their original location, meaning you can backtrack and recover them if necessary, rather than being left short of the count at the exit. However, there are still cases where the devs have completely overlooked major issues. The one I encountered was in the Egypt level. At one point you drop down a pit which, as far as my research unearthed, you can't get back up. This means if you take a certain number of hits down here, you can actually become stuck, unable to complete your objectives. Seeing stuff like this is so damn frustrating. Time Travels would be a far more enjoyable game if they employed a typical damage system, rather than having you drop items every time you hit. Speaking of damage, to me it felt like platforming presented much more of a challenge here, which is not good. I don't hate the platforming controls, they were fine for what you were doing generally in the Rugrats movie, but they certainly haven't been fine-tuned for complex and pinpoint jumps. Whether it's having to weave between enemies or jumping onto platforms with the world's tiniest safe zone, Software Creations have clearly tried to up the ante in the platforming department. This would have been a fine change up if they had adjusted the way it controls, but they haven't. It ends up making the game even more unenjoyable. One of the best examples of the platforming just being too wonky is in the fairy level. You're tasked with jumping onto these leaf platforms, which should be a super simple thing to do. Instead, the stilted jumping and movement makes just getting to the platforms an annoying task. Then there's a 90% chance you'll fall straight through the platform. There's no rhyme or reason to why the game would allow me to land or fall through. You've just got to jump and pray throughout the entire thing. Additionally, there's plenty of other jumps where it's so awkward to get to a higher platform. At times, it feels like it's not physically possible to make these jumps, even though the devs clearly have designed for you to go to these places. And can we talk about the meaningless decision to allow you to slide down slopes? It offers nothing in the game other than giving you a great way to take damage, as once you go into the animation you're stuck and can't move until you're at the bottom. This action is engaged by pressing down on the D-pad, which also happens to be one of the ways you move the camera around. It's such a clunky combination. Returning from the Rugrats movie is my major annoyance at the babies being totally defenseless against enemies. The only way you avoid enemies is by jumping over them, or accidentally landing on them, which will damage you but also kill the enemy. Although the enemies will respawn as soon as you walk off screen, so that's ultimately pointless. It feels like they introduced way more enemies into levels for this follow-up, which makes the lack of an attack stand out considerably more. Would it really have killed them to include something like an attack where the kids throw balls? Search for Reptar and Studio 2 have found ways to adapt weapons into these kids' games without issue. My rage towards the enemies really started peaking when they had enemies popping up out of the ground with no warning. I love to take damage from enemies I couldn't possibly react to and avoid. It's so much fun. Ultimately, it's hard to understand who the hell this game is made for. While many Nicktoons had massive appeal to older audiences, such as Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, and Doug, Rugrats is without a doubt more focused on younger audiences. That's not to say an older audience can't enjoy it, but it's clearly designed mostly with kids in mind. Naturally, you would imagine a Rugrats game has kids as the focus when designing the difficulty, but that's not the case here. This might as well be Mega Man as far as young kids are concerned. There's no possible way this is an enjoyable and accessible difficulty for them. Having played through a fair chunk of the game, I was starting to get really disappointed that no improvements had been made to the formula of the previous game. Apart from the new locations of levels, it was exactly the same game. But then just as I was thinking this, I was smacked in the face with something different. An on-rails shooter level. This was totally unexpected and got me excited again. Until I discovered that, like everything else in the game, it's not fun to play. Controlling the shooting is just so unintuitive, and I found that it wasn't good enough to allow you to react as quickly as the game wanted you to. I was also extremely confused why cups of orange juice left on the ground were damaging me. To be fair to the game, there are some slight tweaks to the formula outside of this level too. By collecting special blocks that are tucked away in levels, you can be taken to bonus levels, which vary in gameplay. The one I unlocked was just a shitty claw machine minigame though, and it was pointless to play. The only thing you gain from it is more points for your score, which I can't say I ever once gave a shit about. The big finale of the game changes things a little too. First up, the driving levels return from Rugrats Movie, with the babies heading to space this time. I'll give them credit for seriously tweaking the hit detection and removing the one-hit kill aspect, but it's still not very fun to play, especially as your finale. Then the very final level you play through is an on-rails Dill section. Dill is in his little rolly gimmick, and all you have to do is press B occasionally to jump over things. It's dull and a very strange way to cap off the game. So yeah, when it comes to gameplay, it's pretty much the same thing as the Rugrats movie. Not much has changed, and the stuff they have changed has made the game even worse. The single aspect where Time Travelers is a massive step up is the visuals. Good lord, this has got to be one of the best looking Game Boy Color games I have ever seen. I've stated previously that I don't really love the visual style of Game Boy Color games, but Time Travelers really contradicts that. The sprite work is absolutely stunning. I'm not exaggerating when I say this might be my favourite looking game I have ever reviewed on this channel. From the research I've done into the games that are most commonly cited as being the best looking Game Boy Color games, I'd have to say Time Travelers really is in the upper echelon. The environments are fantastically detailed and cover a lot of different styles, the characters look spot on, and there's a surprising amount of life in all of the little animations. It's so jarring to go through the stilted and stale gameplay all while looking at visuals that are literally setting the standards for what this console is capable of. It might not be fun to play, but damn, Time Travelers is some eye candy. Rugrats Time Travelers sucks. It's not as bad as some of the absolute dreck I played on the Super Nintendo, but it's still extraordinarily bad. Functioning as a sequel to the Rugrats movie, it brings nothing new to the table in terms of the gameplay. Sure, the graphics are superb, but that isn't enough when the gameplay is identical to the previous game. Just a little tweak here and there could have made this so much more fun to experience. It might not have made this a good game, but it has the potential to be so much more than what we got. If Time Travelers played as good as it looked, it would be one of the greatest 2D platformers in history. Next time, I'll be taking a look at Rugrats Totally Angelica, the first Nickelodeon game of the new millennium. Initially released exclusively as a handheld game, a console version would come the following year. From what I can tell, the home console version seems to be a 3Dified version of the handheld game. Because they're so similar, I may only briefly touch on the handheld version. To make sure you don't miss out on that review and reviews of Wild Thornberrys, SpongeBob and Rocket Power games coming up, make sure you're subscribed.